This video is going to explore another of the prompt words which you might come across in the Art and Design Studies element of the National 5 course in Art and Design. So this week we're going to be looking at visual elements, and the visual elements are the building blocks of what artists use to create their artwork. There are 7 visual elements: line, shape, tone, colour, pattern, texture and form. They form the basis of every artwork, and they're the tools that the artists use to create the visual impact of an artwork. So we're going to first of all look at line. And there are a number of ways in which an artist might use line. Some of the ideas are given here. So an artist might use an outline round about the edge of a shape. They might define something, an object or a person. There may be prominent lines, there might be bold lines. They also can be directional, so they may be straight and angular, or the lines might be curved and flowing and organic. So thinking about, again, the actual physical lines that we can see, we might also have lines that have the effect of dividing up the composition. So it might be a strong vertical or a horizontal line created by an object and a still life, or created by a tree in a landscape, which produces that sort of splitting up of the canvas and the frame. And then thinking about the types of line that an artist might use, so they may use a really thick line, they may use a really bold line, or it might be more scratchy or more broken. So trying to describe those types of lines in the artwork that you're looking at is really useful when you are trying to get marks using this visual element. Next, we're going to have a think about tone. And again, tone is to do with light and dark. It's how the artist shows light and dark and shadow. And tone helps things to look more 3D. So if an artwork uses tone and has lots of tone in it, it will probably look more realistic. When we're thinking about tone, we are thinking about the brightest parts, which we call highlights, the tones in the middle, the mid-tones, and the darkest areas, which are the shadows. And when you're looking at an artwork, it's a good idea to pick out where you see the highlights and where you see the darkest parts. We can also think about how the artist has applied the tone to the artwork. Have they done it in a way which is smooth and blended? Can is the tone obvious? And thinking about the way in which that affects maybe the mood of the artwork or the atmosphere of that. Also will have an effect on the visual impact. Again, we talked about whether it would make it realistic or unrealistic. If there's less tone, it'll tend to look flatter. Next, we're going to think about texture. So texture is to do with the surface quality, so how something feels. And in an artwork, that might be the illusion of a feeling of a texture. It might be the way that an artist painted something to look like soft flowing fabric, or it may be the way that they've painted something to look rough and bumpy and uneven. And there's also the way in which an artist can apply materials to create a real texture on something in an artwork, and particularly that might apply to 3D artworks and sculptures. We want to be able to describe the textures that we see, so if we're looking at an artwork and we can see that it's rough, trying to expand our vocabulary to be able to describe that in much more in-depth ways will really help you to be more specific in your answers. So could you describe it as being coarse? Could you look at it being uneven, bumpy, worn? Thinking about these words will really help you to improve your descriptions. Colour is another of the visual elements, and I've done a separate video for this one because there's so much to say about colour. These are just some of the most important points. So we've got primary, secondary and tertiary colours. And we've talked about already in the other video about colour in terms of how to make a colour lighter and darker, thinking about harmonious colours, colours that are close together on the colour wheel, or colours which are really different from each other in contrast and are opposite sides from the colour wheel. Thinking about whether something has lots of colours or whether it's in a much more restricted palette is another way that we might describe the colours that we see in an artwork. Shape is another of the visual elements, and shape is when we are seeing 2D shapes, 2D forms, okay? And the quality of these might be that they are geometric shapes, so we might have things like circles and squares and triangles that all have a regular number of sides or angles that we can determine those by. Or they may be organic shapes, like a leaf shape, and everybody kind of draws those shapes slightly differently. It's thinking about the way in which the artist has used shapes. Have they used shapes which are all very soft and flowing and curved, or are they much more angular? Really looking for those types of shapes. Thinking about the proportion of the shapes and the size of them in relation to each other, again within an artwork, is really, really important. And that idea that the shape will have an impact on the mood and the atmosphere. When we start to add tone to a shape, it becomes three-dimensional, and we don't call it a shape anymore, we think of it as a form. There are some examples of some forms on this slide here. So when we're thinking of 3D forms, we're thinking of cylinders, cubes, cuboids, pyramids, cones, and lots of kind of common everyday objects. Often you find that actually when they're simplified into a 3D form, these are the ones that we see most often. So an artist, if they're using, they may be trying to create the look of form, or it might be something specifically that they are doing to create an actual 3D piece of artwork. So it might be carving or sculpting, or it may well just be their use of tone that makes something look 3D. Lastly, we're going to look at pattern. And again, a pattern is something which repeats. It might be a colour that repeats, a shape that repeats, a line that repeats, an object that repeats. And it forms that pattern which is very eye-catching. Okay, patterns may be regular, so they may be spaced out in an actual kind of configuration, or they may be much more random. There seems to be no, they repeat, but there's no order to that pattern. Again, it may be shapes, geometric shapes, it may be organic shapes, it may be lines that repeat. And again, the scale and the proportion of the pattern, it might be something which is very small, so there are lots and lots of repeats, or it might be something much bigger. And we call the thing that repeats in a pattern the motif. Pattern has an effect again on the mood and the atmosphere and the visual impact particularly. Pattern is eye-catching. When somebody wears a pattern, they stand out in a room of people. So a pattern in an artwork often draws our attention to look at a certain area of that artwork where the pattern is. So, as we've said, artists use the visual elements as the building blocks for their artworks. And the effect of these visual elements usually contributes to the mood of the artwork, or, like we've said, the visual impact and the emphasis on certain parts of it. Think about how artists use colour to draw our eye to certain areas. Think about how, if an artist uses a patterned backdrop, how we're drawn in to look at it. All of these things have an impact which the artist is trying to create for us in that artwork. What I'd like you to do now as a wee revision task is to have a think about these 7 visual elements. And a really good way of revising this is to create a word bank for these visual elements. So you might create flashcards, or you might create a mind map, whatever way works for you, but take each of them and start to come up with as many different words as you possibly can to describe colour, line, tone, texture, shape, pattern, form. the more that you come up with and the more used to these words that you have in your vocabulary, the better your answers will be. And it might help you to have a look at some paintings or some artworks to inspire the kind of words that you will create. Once you've done that, you might want to have a look at some of these particular artworks and have a go at thinking about what is the main visual element that I can see, what is the most prominent one within each of these paintings. And once you've decided on the most prominent one, try to write down 3 fully formed points for each of them. So if you choose, for example, the first one on pattern, try to write 3 things down about the way the artist has used that pattern within the painting. Try to remember to use your structure of what, where, why to back up your points with evidence of where you see that technique, where you see the use of pattern, and why you think the artist has chosen to use it in that way.